Chapter 6, Son of Naomi. The Beat Generation. Jack, Bruce Cook. The central fact that one must come to grips with an understanding Allen Ginsberg and his present importance as a prophet and teacher, and only incidentally as a poet, is that he is now very different from that intense, wrathful young man who first exploded onto the scene, snarling out his howl to the world. He began with the muse of hatred, wrote Alan Harrington, of a character readily identifiable as Ginsberg in his novel The Secret Swinger, having reviled his times and been honored for it. The poet had raged out of his dark strangeness and become attractive. And while the other portraits of the younger Ginsberg may vary somewhat in emphasis, they all seem to agree that he was a chronically angry and reckless experimenter with life, his own and others. And today he is much different. Certainly one of the most completely open and altogether decent people you were likely to meet among the great public personalities of our age. And yes, you are likely to meet him, for all that really takes is the courage to thrust out your hand to him and introduce yourself. He has the most disarming manner. People who approach him with specific ideas about who or what he is are most likely to find that their preconception of him has changed within the space of a few minutes' conversation. His biographer, Jane Kramer, is case on point. In her introduction to Allen Ginsberg in America, she describes her first meeting with him. A meeting which she carried an idea of him as a worn beatnik, whose poetry was affecting, but whose style of life was bound to be ridiculous. And true enough, there is much in his style of life that is ridiculous. Ginsberg, I think, would be the first to concede that. But as Miss Kramer discovered, none of it mattered much when once she got to know him.
I'll confess to a certain uneasiness of my own when I first met him, which just goes to show how tightly we hold on to first impressions. For my earliest exposure to Allen Ginsberg dated back to 1958, and I had immediately perceived the hostility in him that then always bubbled near the surface. There were stories of shouting matches, angry denunciations of whole audiences, and that classic anecdote from an early reading in Los Angeles. He was asked rather skeptically by a member of the audience just what he thought he was trying to prove with his poetry, to which Ginsberg replied simply, nakedness. Unsatisfied, the questioner persisted, what do you mean by that? Whereupon Ginsberg took off all his clothes and showed him. Well, I'm not sure what I expected when I actually met him some years later, but I wasn't quite prepared for the directness and easy cordiality I got from him then. Sure, he'd see me, of course. He was going out of town on a lecture tour. As a matter of fact, he was catching a jet out of Kennedy in an hour. But after that, certainly. I'm the Allen Ginsberg in the phone book, he added. Call me. Eventually I did, marveling that he still kept a listed number. What must that cost him in interruptions, I asked myself. I'm not sure that he really remembered me from our brief earlier meeting, but we made a date and I showed up at the appointed hour, notebook in hand and full of questions and apprehensions. He disposed of the latter very quickly. There was a sort of pause before we began, in which he did what he could to put me at my ease, asking general questions about what I was interested in, trying to get me to open up. By the time I was ready to start asking him questions, I found that he had been answering them a while already. Yes, sure, there are many elements of continuity from the Beats to the present. This was volunteered and not an answer to a direct question. Just look around you and then look back and you can see where it all began. Drugs? The first serious experimentation with altered states of consciousness came with the Beats using pot and peyote. Indigenous music? You can see the movement from jazz and rhythm and blues and on the road to rock today. You can say we had a preoccupation with the Theruvian and Whitmanic tradition, and so we were very responsive to this whole rediscovery of the body of the land. And the Eastern elements that interest young people today, well, look at Gary Snyder, look at the Buddhist stuff in Mexico City Blues. Look at yourself, I put in. Yes, he said, look.
Just then, I could hardly have done otherwise, for as Allen Ginsberg began to warm to the subject, he began talking at me, in the way he often does. His face was close to mine, and though we were about the same height, I found he was peering up at me, for he had dropped down into a crouch as he went on. The thick beard he wears obscures the lower portion of his face almost completely, so that attention naturally is drawn to his eyes, which flicker and move intently, rather than stare. I asked him how he might sum up the beat movement as an idea. What was the heart of it intellectually? Well, there was a return to nature and the revolt against the machine. And I think this is very important, for you can see all this in the reduplication of the cycle today.
Return to nature.
The fact that the basic human proportion has not been lost owes something, I think, to these beginnings. Because we can still talk to one another in these human ways. You see, you and me together means that the art is still possible. Ginsberg hesitated a moment, as through grasping back for the thread and then plunged on. It's all been in the Gnostic tradition, the underground and mystical tradition of the West. Not that we originated it, just carried it on a little here in America. Yes, here it's a problem, because it's only by getting out from under the American flag and marching to a different drummer in the Thoreauvian sense, that one can find one's own self here. And you have to do it too. It's either that or take that mass-produced self they keep trying to shove down your throat with their cigarette advertisements and so on. But look, he concluded suddenly, I'll bet you want to talk about more practical matters, don't you? Well, addresses. You want addresses? You said you would be going out to the West Coast, didn't you? Here, let me get my book and maybe I can help you decide who to see out there.
You got 90 seconds.
This, as sudden as the shifting of the gears, was a new Allen Ginsberg. One that I had heard talked about often, but never seen in action. In a sour moment, Gregory Corso is supposed to have called him a Jewish businessman. And perhaps curiously, there was certainly that quality in him. He gets things done. That apartment in East Village, which he shared with Peter Orlovsky for years as a kind of command post for the beat movement. And the Cultural Revolution that evolved from it. Out of it, Ginsberg wrote letters, made phone calls, urging editors to publish the work of this young novelist or that poet, rallying support for causes of all kinds. And Allen Ginsberg's address book, which he carries with him wherever and whenever he moves, is fabled as a kind of international who's who of the revolution. Oh, a kind of international who's who of the revolution, yeah. If you want to get in touch with an old wobbly poet in Seattle, Ginsberg has his address and the phone number of the next door neighbor who takes his calls. Who sells the best hash in Kabul? It's all in Ginsberg's book. I need to fucking read that damn book. Oh, man. I wonder where that is today. Anyway, the addresses I needed were the ones you might have expected. A few poets on the West Coast, Burroughs' address in London, and a few others in Europe, and so on. Ginsberg was free with suggestions. Oh, you really must see so-and-so. Or what about such and such? He's been buried down there for years. And he'd be delighted if someone came down and interviewed.